Welcome back to Right on Four Corners. I'm your host, DelSheree Gladden. I am a USA Today bestselling author with over 30 published novels, and I'm also a high school English teacher. And we're recording this right before I go back on break, and a few weeks before the book we're going to be talking out is set to be released. But by the time our listeners are hearing this episode, My Bonnie Lies Under by Susan Cummins Miller will be out and available, and we'll hopefully get you interested in checking it out and reading it. This is one I really had a lot of fun with, and I'm excited to talk about. So, Susan, please go ahead and introduce yourself to our listeners.
Thank you, DelSheree. It's just a pleasure to be with you. My background, because I always start with that, my background is in geology, anthropology, history, paleontology, with a lot of biology thrown in. So when I turned to writing, I tried to weave elements of all of those into my writing. My background is that I worked as a field geologist in the West for the U.S. Geological Survey, published geologic papers and maps, and then taught geology and oceanography at the college level. Eventually, when we arrived in Tucson, I realized that we had a special needs son, and I had to figure out a way to work from home and how to do geology from home. That was a tough one at the time. So I said, well, a number of my family members are writers, so I've been wanting to write a mystery series forever. So I began writing the Frankie McFarlane Geologist mysteries. But before they were picked up, I actually got a contract to write a historical nonfiction book called A Sweet Separate Intimacy, Women Writers of the American Frontier from 1800 to 1922. That was published first by the University of Utah Press and then later again by the Texas Tech University Press. My interest I think, is writing about women of various times, but generally what connects them is the West. And so the Frankie McFarlane books are contemporary mysteries, and there are 6 of those from Texas Tech University Press. What I've written this time goes back to the 1800s. So I'm returning to a time in the West when you had these phenomenal geologists mapping the West. And I thought I would love to introduce people to some of those figures who were so important in the background of the geology of the Western U.S. and the opening of the West to settlement. I set this present book, which is a historical mystery, in 1885. So I began writing My Bonnie Lies Under, and I realized I needed to give her context. I needed to do her backstory more. She is the daughter of a geologist, an exploration geologist, a mining specialist, and her mother was a botanist and an artist, illustrator. So she comes from 2 scientists, and she doesn't really fit in the world as of that Victorian time, 1885, and she is now orphaned. So how does she fashion family? And the quest of this story is to understand how she'll function in her new reality. Her father had the presence of mind to make sure that she had guardians, 2 geologists. So they are accompanying her from the old world, in this case Shanghai and Yokohama, to the new world, San Francisco, which is where she was born, but she's been away for 2 years. This first book in the Karadec Reese mystery series, it takes place, I would say, 80% of it on the ship, traveling from one port to another. And there is someone who does, or a group of people who do not want her to reach San Francisco alive. So the focus of the mystery is who wants her not to survive, why, and how does she both solve that mystery and survive while planning what she's going to do once she reaches shore.
It's really a lot of different elements that you bring together in this, because we're looking at an underage young woman and the complications that arise there of needing a guardian, not only in a legal sense, but just in a physical sense. She's not supposed to be wandering around by herself. You bring in the social class issues as well at different parts, that difference between the academic side of the world that's kind of progressing and growing going compared to dealing with the working class and how she's got to navigate moving between those two. So there's really a lot of different things that you bring into what's simply classified as a historical mystery.
Yeah.
There's a lot more that goes into it.
This context is everything, is it not?
Yeah.
And of course, I'm trying to show the reader what the world, her world at least, her small portion of it was like. And it had all these complexities, little bits of history that people didn't realize. But the United States had 3 years before declared a ban on any people from the Orient, particularly China, coming into the United States. So most people don't realize that the U.S. has done this. That's just a piece of history, but it ends up affecting Caradec Reese's life. And we're not going to give away the plot or say how, but I think people look back on the Victorian era as just this, as one thing. Well, depending on where you were in the world, it was a lot of different things intermingling. There was tremendous change going on in the western part of the United States, but there was also tremendous change going on throughout the world. And this particular character has lived with her father in South America. She has lived in mining camps in the U.S. She has been within the Orient while he is what they called the Orient at that time, while he is exploring. And so her take on the world is quite different than a normal turning 15-year-old would have. Women tended to be girls who were put in they were kept apart as much as possible, at least with her class, from interacting with other classes. And yet here we've got a woman who is interacting with people from steerage on the ship going across. So I think what I like about doing it this way is that it's complex. The world always was complex. And I think that a girl of that age, we have to remember, was of marriageable age in many parts of the world, and that included many states in the United States. So she is trying to act independently because she's been independent effectively for years. And yet the world has these rules about her which limit her or try to limit her. So how does she escape that in one sense or act within the confines of culture's rules and requirements?
Well, and I thought that was a really interesting intersection in this book, is that you've got this young woman who's had an unusual upbringing. As you said, she hasn't lived kind of the cloistered life of a lot of Victorian girls, of not just stereotypical, but literally needlepoint and education being very limited to only the things that they thought were necessary or proper for young women to learn. To be constantly watched and treated like small children even as they got older, having these companions and being basically groomed to be wives and mothers. Like that was the expectation for most of these girls, that you learn how to do, what were considered womanly arts, and that was your life moving forward. And so you have her who's grown up in a very different environment, but who's coming back into regular mainstream society for her class. But you've got these added complications of her parents are no longer living, and there's a vast business empire that she's trying to maintain control of while being underage and navigating that on the legal side of things, but then also facing these social barriers. And it brings a lot of elements together that as the reader, you're going into this, it's a mystery, trying to figure out who's trying to kill her, lots of secrets are revealed, but you also stop and think at various points in the story of like, oh, really? That's how that was? I think I had known at one point, but then I was reminded that the age of majority in that time period was 21, not 18. And so it's like a 3-year difference of trying to be emancipated is different than add to that another, 6
Three
years.
3 years.
Yeah, where it's like that
Yeah.
complicates things. And, at one point, like she's kind of boxed into her cabin because they don't have a female companion to walk around the ship with her and things like that,
Yeah.
where you really are shown as the reader that this was not the simple time period that maybe we envision in our mind, the ladies in pretty dresses and parasols and all of that. There were a lot of complex issues that women particularly had to try to navigate and either outright go against and risk the consequences of that, or maneuver their way through the social and legal restrictions of the time to have some level of freedom and control over their own lives. It was really difficult.
Yes, it was. As I was writing this, I realized that I was going back on that nonfiction, that anthology I'd written about the women writers of the frontier. And she overlapped with, okay, my character's fictional, but she did overlap in a mining camp with Mary Halleck Foote, for instance, in Leadville. And there were these other role models that she had. She had her mother as a role model, but within the United States, there were women who were remarkable intellects and remarkable talents, like Margaret Fuller. She was long gone before 1885, but Mary Austin was there. She was another person who was very much like I envision Carrie being in terms of the intellect and the talents and the unusual way of seeing the world and the way she carved a life for herself outside of the strictures of convention at the time. And so I'm hoping to be able to weave some of these women into the story so that people realize Carrie was incredibly unusual, but she wasn't. But there were others who had gone before her. And so there were people that she had heard about or met or read who were finding their way despite all of the hurdles that were put in front of them. And we know who they are. Today we know who they are. So it's not just the men who were mapping the West who were important to me as I was writing this, but the women who were writing about the frontier who were important. And I don't know where this series will go, but I'm hoping to be able to include some of these people as context.
It made me think about, and I've been trying to remember what the name of the book was, and I don't remember. It was quite a while ago that I read it, kind of like a time traveling type thing, where this woman ends up back in the time when the Chicago's World Fair is happening.
Oh,
And she wanders around the fair and finds her way to the women's building. And I had not known about the women's building. I'd kind of knew generally about the Chicago World's Fair and just the basics of that. But it was really interesting that this was an attraction and it was highlighting. It was built, designed, decorated, all of it by a team of women to highlight the work that women were doing in art, literature, science throughout the world. And in the book, it talked specifically about some of the exhibits that the character was like really taken aback by and hadn't realized that these were things invented or designed or created by women. And I think that's a time period where, unless it's pointed out or our attention is drawn to it, a lot of the time we don't realize the contributions of women in those time periods because they weren't highlighted at the time. It was
that's exactly right.
downplayed. It sometimes even hidden or just outright not given credit to the women involved. And it's so nice to be able to see that is being paid attention to more, and those extraordinary women are being highlighted more now than they were in their own time period.
I agree. I mean, when I was in college, there were no women's studies departments. So I couldn't take a course in it. I ended up having to teach myself. And then that, of course, ended up being this anthology. But there's been a tremendous burgeoning of research, which is what I hope to foster when I wrote that, about women by women, to emphasize what women contributed, because we, as you say, we've forgotten. We probably stumbled across a reference to it at some point, but then we forgot because there are other things in our life. But the last 30, 35 years have been extraordinary in the amount of material that has been researched and put out there, and yet it's still not commonly known in the classroom, for instance.
Absolutely. Well, and I think that that is something that in our current atmosphere of things that are going on, some of the progress that has been made is not always progressing forward because of, we won't get into all of that. But
no, please, no, let's have a day off.
Yes. But it is something that I think about this book makes you stop and think of some of the aspects of our own history in the United States and throughout the world, even where you stop and ponder those people who've made contributions or those societies or cultures, all of the things that have really had an impact, but that don't get studied, don't get the notoriety, or just are ignored or not accepted. And it's really sad to see when that happens, because us as people who have come after that have been impacted by things that we don't understand, that we don't really know a lot about because
Correct.
it's ignored or hidden or downplayed or whatever. So I really enjoy finding books, especially because I read a ton, but the variety of ways where some of these unrepresented or underrepresented people or voices or art are brought back up to the surface to help us understand a little bit better where our society and where even some just everyday things that we use all the time that we have no idea who created and invented that. And a lot of times people that you really wouldn't have thought to expect. And that's a fun discovery.
I agree. Oh, yes. One of my favorite movies is Hidden Figures.
Mm-hmm.
Here are these brilliant women, and until they put their stories into a popular form with great actors and great script, we, 99.9% of the world, had never heard of them. And yet they affected us so much of what we have witnessed in the last 50 or 60 years.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I agree with you. The work is being done, and I just applaud the people doing it, whether it's a focus on a very, very narrow aspect and sharing that with people, the world, or a broader aspect.
I think one of the fun things when the British government started declassifying a lot of their wartime documents, I'd read several books from that time period, and I found it really interesting to see how big of a role women played behind the scenes, that throughout their lifetime, they were never able to talk about that with the people in their family or their friends or, their loved ones. They had to keep all of that confidential. And now we're getting to see, oh, wow, like they actually, that was a huge effort from a ton of women who never even got to discuss it, let alone, be honored for their contributions. And I was really kind of blown away reading some of that information and hearing those stories of those women.
Oh, yes. And I love film. I love movies. I think the visuals can be so powerful. So you get something like the Bletchley Circle, which, as you say, and they were decoding messages in Britain. They couldn't talk about it. And PBS did a great series on that, a fictional series. But then, a week or two ago, they had a wonderful story, a movie showing women, African-American women sorting mail and getting it to the troops towards the end of World War II. And who knew? No one knew that story. Mm-hmm. Someone had to reveal it, and it reaches a broader population, usually through film, than a book like mine, which will reach a narrower population. But I think the more we can do, the better off the world will be. Just focusing on points of time and women's contributions.
Definitely. Well, and I hope that this book reaches a good range of people. Because like I said, I really enjoyed it for for all the aspects of, I enjoyed the mystery. You kept me guessing, so that was great, because nothing's worse than getting 25% into a book and you're like, dang it, I already know how this is going to end. So that was good.
Exactly.
But I did really enjoy learning about the time period and the different challenges presented. And you have kind of some notes at the end that tell about what parts are accurate historical facts and which parts you've taken creative license with. So I wanted to ask you about that blending of the two. how did you, I guess, approach or choose or navigate real people that you incorporate in, that you're kind of having to fill in the gaps and put them in a situation that wasn't, necessarily real, and weaving that into the story and the world that you've created for your characters?
Well, it's a tough thing to do. And all along the way in my writing career, I've had to consider this. In my first mystery novel, I set it in a tiny little village, which was where I had been working when I stopped working for the U.S. Geological Survey. But I renamed the place and I added some streets. So I fictionalized it in that way because I felt I didn't want to expose people who were actually living there to my fiction. In this case, we're talking about 1885. There was the ship Oceanic. It was doing Trans-Pacific runs, but I didn't try to use the staff that was actually on board. I put fictional characters in there. And, I had to set scenes with several people in the staterooms that were relatively small. And so, yeah, maybe they are a little bit bigger in my story than they were on board ship to accommodate action within the story. But I tried to be careful not to have it blatantly wrong, or that it would just fit gently with the action of the story. But it is a tough call in terms of using one of the geologists that I have loved reading about, Samuel Frank Emmons. I bring him into the story. He was one of the main mappers with Clarence King in the West, and he was, mapped in Leadville, Colorado. He was one of the early members of the U.S. Geological Survey. Clarence King was the first head of the U.S. Geological Survey. I wanted to use somebody who was relatively unencumbered. He did not have children. And so there are fewer people I figured, who would take offense if I had him incorporated into Carrie's life. So I have tried to put him where he was pretty much when he was there. And he is a fascinating figure. And I've blended her family history in to the point that her father and mother knew him when he studied in Europe. So he was there. They were fictional, her parents. And I think you have the fictional points kind of work around the actual stakes in the ground that are things we know for fact. And we just have to be pretty careful that there aren't the anachronisms. And we have to have really good beta readers to try and catch them if we do accidentally put something in.
That is tough, especially with historical periods that people are fairly familiar with. It's none of us were alive then, but,
No,
it's
no.
recent enough that we have documents, we have, the ability to know for sure what was going on during those time periods where the 1100s might be a little bit more vague.
Yeah, maybe. Well, and it is wonderful to have enough research done recently that you can get a picture of what the Oceanic looks like at that period of time, because it was completely refurbished later on and had been refurbished already once. So these things were important for me to be able to see a picture of what it looked like and understand that they didn't have a second class. They had the first class, and then they had everybody else was in steerage. And you don't think about that. You don't think that most of the people on board a ship traveling from Yokohama to San Francisco are below decks. Not the whole time. I mean, they come out for air, they are fed, but it is a system with classes. But there were only basically two classes, and the people working on the ship, of course. Those things I needed to read up on. And so I've tried to stay as faithful to them as I could, given, we don't know everything about those voyages, but we know a lot.
And filling in the gaps and taking a reasonable amount of creative license. I think readers will suspend their disbelief for things like that,
As long as
There's
you
a
don't
reasonable
push it
amount.
too far.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
reasonable is really the correct word. And the I know with myself that the willing suspension of disbelief comes crashing down if somebody pushes it too far.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think you balanced it all and brought the realistic and the fictional elements together really well. I enjoyed learning about the time period as well as seeing your fictional characters move through it and deal with the various aspects that come with that time period. And I'm looking forward to the next part of Caradic's story, which you leave the reader. I won't say, what the ending is, but you leave the reader posed for more. So tell us a little bit about what you have planned for the series.
So we all have to recognize that the heroine lives. This isn't a book where we lose her at the end. So
it's hard to make a series when you do that.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and that she is on her way to Denver. We know that much. So in the next book, it's the Western landscape, especially the Rocky Mountains that will serve as the backdrop and the context for the adventures. Obviously, no, I can't tell you. I have to be very careful.
Yes.
But we know she is heading for Denver, and we know she is heading for a school in Denver. And we know that she is with Emmons. I've already told you that, really. So she has people with her. But again, how does she fashion family? How does she create family? And we all have to face this. I think when we leave home, move into school, move into job, we fashion families. And there are those we're born with and those we choose. And she must choose the people who are her family. Being an orphan, there's a sense of freedom in that, but there's a tremendous responsibility because it's down to her to figure out who she is going to become and what she is going to do and how she'll survive. Because as we end the book, there are still people after her.
Yeah, she still has a lot to navigate as she's, moving on in her personal life. She's still got a lot unresolved from book one that she's got to conquer or attempt to find her way through in the successive books. And so, yeah, I'm interested to see where she goes and how she manages all of that in the next one. I'm hoping to have you back on when you're ready for that book, which I don't think we have a timeline for yet, but it'll be coming through Artemisia, I'm assuming.
Yeah, they're so wonderful.
Good.
I have to admit, so Artemisia is great.
Well, I will patiently wait for whenever you have that ready and have you back on to talk more. But we are out of time for this episode. So tell us before we leave, where can readers find you and the book, My Bonnie Lies Under, if they would like to check it out and see what else you have coming in the future?
Well, I do have a website, which is susancumminsmiller.com. And they can find my work, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, or poetry, on there. And I was told the other day that you can go on Amazon right now and pre-order the Caradic Reese first book, My Bonnie Lies Under, and it will be out on the 21st of January.
And generally, anywhere people typically buy books from, Artemisia Publishing typically distributes just about everywhere. So should be fairly easy to find, and I hope people do. As I said, I really enjoyed reading it, and I had fun getting to know the characters and the history and the time period as well.
Thank you so much, DelSheree. This has been so much fun.
Well, thank you for taking the time to come on, and I do look forward to having you back in the future.
Okay, me too.